everyone, my name is Oksana Pijik and I'm a pharmacist and Associate Professor of Pharmacy Practice and Policy at the UCL School of Pharmacy in London, England. I'm also the founder of UCL Fight the Fakes and Academic Chair of the Fight the Fakes Alliance Executive Board, working to raise awareness, enhance education and training, and expand research around substandard and falsified medical products. Today I'm delighted to be speaking about the pharmacist's role in addressing substandard and falsified medical products for this episode of FIP's CPD Bite. In this session, we will cover the following: define and differentiate between substandard and falsified medical products, describe the global burden and impact of SF medical products, identify their key characteristics and warning signs, as well as understand the pharmacist's role in identifying, reporting, and preventing the circulation of substandard and falsified medical products in both community and hospital settings. I will also highlight some useful FIP resources and advocacy initiatives that you can join related to SF meds. So let's start with definitions, because understanding the difference between these two terms is critical for tackling the problem effectively. Historically, the terminology has always been very complicated. Prior to 2017, it was known as SSFFC, substandard, spurious, falsely labeled, falsified, counterfeit medicines, and it was a very politically complex area. At the World Health Assembly in 2017, it was agreed that definitions had to be streamlined, and counterfeit was removed from the WHO lexicon and in reference to this issue, although many pharma industry partners still use that term. So let's start with substandard medical products. These are ones that fail to meet quality standards or specifications. This usually happens unintentionally, for example, through manufacturing errors, poor storage, or degradation in transit. But the key thing here is that there is a legitimate manufacturer, whereas falsified medical products, by contrast, are deliberately or fraudulently misrepresented in their identity, composition, or source. These are made to deceive, often containing wrong ingredients, no active ingredient, or even harmful toxic substances. And so the act of deceit in this instance is criminal. While the causes differ with substandard medical products, this is usually accidental and falsified. Again, the intent is criminal. Both can lead to the same outcome, serious patient harm. Recognizing the distinction is essential because each demands a different response. For substandard medicines, regulatory strengthening and quality assurance is the primary focus, whereas enforcement and international collaboration is required for falsified medical products. Alongside substandard and falsified medicines, the WHO has also recognized a third category of unlicensed or unregistered medical products. And these are medicines or vaccines that have not been evaluated, authorized, or approved of by the national regulatory authority in the country where they're being distributed or used. So in other words, the product itself may be genuine and manufactured by a reputable company in another country, but it has not undergone the local regulatory required to confirm its safety, efficacy, or quality for a specific market. So such products often enter circulation through unauthorized importation or procurement channels that bypass national approval systems. However, they may also be introduced during public health emergency when urgency of access surpasses the pace of local regulatory review. And in these cases, countries may be temporarily allowed the use of products that are not yet registered nationally but have been authorized. So, for example, through WHO's emergency use listing or approval by another stringent regulatory authority. And so while in those very specific circumstances there are emergency use recognized mechanisms, they still require oversight. So again, outside of those circumstances, when unregistered and unlicensed medicines enter the market, it can be because it's not been reviewed by the FDA, for instance. So this can also, in different points, be problematic. When we talk about how falsified medicines reach patients, it's important to understand the difference between legitimate and illicit supply chains. In the legitimate regulated supply chain, every step is designed to protect the patient safety. Medicines are procured under good manufacturing practice and distributed according to good distribution practice. Only licensed manufacturers, wholesalers, and pharmacies are allowed to handle these products. Even when patients buy online, legal, and this is the key word here, legal internet pharmacies must operate within this same regulated network. They are inspected, traceable, and display official verification marks. So, for example, in the EU, there's the EU common logo. In the US, there's the Verified Internet Pharmacy Practice Site, VIPS seal. And these symbols tell consumers that the source is trusted, transparent, and compliant with safety standards. They are regulated. However, the problem is that often there's low awareness amongst consumers about these logos and how to verify these sites. If we look at illicit channels, falsified medicines enter through a completely different route, and this is the unregulated or black market. And this includes unregistered online vendors. So these are websites that operate unlawfully. They may not require any prescriptions, such as social media sellers as well, or informal and street or market traders. Again, they bypass every safeguard in the regulated system and often sell prescription-only medicines directly to consumers without medical oversight, and these are usually falsified. These illicit channels are now the major route of exposure to falsified medical products globally. Criminal networks exploit gaps in these regulations. Also, during the pandemic, we saw that there were many COVID-related falsified products, and due to sometimes access issues or cost issues, stockouts, etc., and the growing demand for quick fixes sold online. So while the legitimate supply chain is designed to protect patients through oversight and traceability, the unregulated market undermines it, turning the internet and informal trade into global gateways for falsified drugs that can cause real harm. According to the WHO, 1 in 10 medical products circulating in low and middle income countries is estimated to be substandard or falsified, with the highest burden across the African region accounting for approximately 42% of all documented cases, followed by the Eastern Mediterranean and Southeast Asia regions. However, this figure is almost certainly an underestimate, as in some regions surveillance systems remain limited, data collection is inconsistent, and cases are chronically underreported. Pharmacists and other healthcare professionals may not be trained to identify, detect, or recognize cases where the real problem may not be the disease, but a substandard or falsified medical product. And so a tox report is not usually the first avenue that is pursued. So measuring the true global burden is challenging given the absence of harmonized reporting systems and the clandestine nature of falsified medicine networks. Nonetheless, this statistic represents far more than numbers. It reflects millions of patients exposed to medicines that may be ineffective, contaminated, or dangerously incorrect in composition or in dose. Importantly, this is not a problem confined to low and middle income countries, although the burden is highest there. WHO data confirm that cases have been reported in every single WHO region, including Europe and North America. What differs is the scale, and we have seen that, unfortunately, the African region tends to be the dumping ground for falsified medicines and remains the most heavily affected, driven by constrained regulatory capacity and fragmented supply chains, as well as limited access to affordable, quality-assured medicines. Another key point is that both generic and branded products are targeted, and these are reported through the WHO's Global Surveillance and Monitoring System, known as GSMS, and some of the most frequently reported substandard and falsified medicines include antibiotics, which contributes to antimicrobial resistance, analgesics, and oncology or cancer therapies, products that patients depend on daily for life-saving treatment. So the consequences extend far beyond individual harm. Each substandard or falsified product erodes public confidence in health systems and accelerates AMR, as underdosed or poor quality antibiotics drive the selection of resistant strains. History shows that the devastating potential of poor quality medicines. So if we go back to 1937, where diethylene glycol, or DEG, actually occurred in the US, and this is a toxic solvent found in brake fluid and antifreeze, was used in a drug formulation that killed more than 100 people, and as a result, led directly to the creation of the modern FDA. Yet similar, and there hasn't been a case of DEG poisoning in the US since then. Elsewhere in the world, however, these tragedies continue and incidents persist, including the DEG-related poisonings in the Gambia, Uzbekistan, Iraq, Indonesia, and other countries dating back to 2022, where hundreds of children died consuming cough syrups that were contaminated with DEG. And this reminds us that weak regulatory controls continue to cost lives nearly a century later. Ultimately, what may begin as a supply chain failure or criminal act rapidly escalates into a public health crisis, weakening the very foundations of global health security. Building on the global epidemiology that we just covered, it is essential to consider the systemic determinants that sustain public health threat. So weak regulatory systems remain a primary driver, and this requires great resource. Fewer than 30% of national regulatory authorities globally are considered to have the capacity to perform all core functions effectively, according to the WHO Global Benchmarking Tool published in 2023. Many national medicines regulatory authorities remain under-resourced, lacking technical capacity, trained personnel, and enforcement mechanisms required to uphold good manufacturing and distribution practices. Inadequate inspection, limited post-market surveillance, and an absence of harmonized legislation between countries and jurisdictions allow substandard and falsified medical products to move across borders with minimal deterrence. And with few punitive sanctions, where they do exist, are often insufficient to disrupt the economic incentives sustaining this illicit trade. Also, supply chain complexity contributes significantly to vulnerability. Every time a medicine moves across intermediaries or cross-border transactions, that obscures the product provenance and accountability. This is often what happens in humanitarian emergencies and conflict-affected settings, where formal distribution systems collapse and stockouts are frequent. Opportunistic entry of medicines have been repeatedly documented, including falsified antimalarials, antibiotics, and vaccines. Also, as we said earlier, limited access and affordability remain critical. Over 2 billion people worldwide still lack access to essential medicines. Combine that with elevated prices and persistent shortages compel patients, even health facilities, to procure medicines through informal or unregulated channels. This includes online vendors and local market stalls, because the idea is that having some medicine is better than no medicine. The WHO Director General, Dr. Tedros, has said there is no universal health coverage, no health security without access to quality medicines. Also, consumer awareness and education represent another weak point, highlighting the need for robust public information campaigns, such as Fight the Fakes. Many patients, pharmacists, prescribers alike struggle to differentiate between online pharmacies that are legitimate and those that are operating illegally, meaning that they do not meet regulatory requirements, often dispensing medicines without prescriptions. However, many lay people may not realize they need a prescription for certain products. So, for example, what I'm seeing a lot is GLP-1 agonists being purchased through social media channels. So public awareness of these risks is low, and pharmacists need to communicate with their patients about where they are getting their medicines from. Finally, corruption across pharmaceutical value chain exacerbates these channels. Transparency International, which is an NGO, identified corruption in procurement, inspection, and customs processes as a major facilitator of substandard and falsified product circulation, further undermining public trust in health institutions. Collectively, these interlocking factors, regulatory fragility, supply chain complexity, inequitable access, and low consumer awareness, as well as systemic corruption, form a permissive ecosystem for the production and distribution of substandard and falsified medical products. So to address them, we need multi-sectoral interventions that strengthen regulatory governance, enhance supply chain transparency, and ensure equitable access of medicines globally. So we've looked at some structural drivers, and here we also have a figure that looks at the bigger picture, the global impact, the strategies needed to prevent substandard and falsified medical products through a systems framework that I developed and published in the journal Nature. It illustrates how substandard and falsified medical products emerge and persist within a highly interconnected global ecosystem, and also highlights that this is not an isolated problem. They're interdependent failures that reinforce one another. So weak oversight interacts with market pressures and behavioral factors, aggressive advertising in some countries, for instance, and governance gaps across entire life cycle of a medicine. So vulnerabilities occur at every stage, from poor quality control to even storage for unsafe online purchasing and improper handling. Perhaps most importantly, the framework captures that the feedback loops that sustain this crisis. When patients receive poor quality medicine, they lose trust in formal health systems and often turn to informal or online markets, which only fuels further spread of falsified products. This systems lens also helps explain the scale of harm we see in sub-Saharan Africa, where overlapping vulnerabilities translate into devastating human losses. Across 39 countries, around 122,000 child deaths each year are linked to poor quality anti-malarials specifically, and that's just one form of drug. When falsified pneumonia treatments are included, the toll rises to over 280,000 preventable child deaths annually. And frankly, these figures are likely to be an underestimate of the true burden, since many treatment failures or adverse reactions go unreported in fragile surveillance systems. It's also an economic burden that we need to consider. Globally, the World Customs Organization values the falsified medicines trade at up to US $200 billion each year, making it one of the most lucrative forms of transnational crime. Profits from this illicit trade are not benign. They fund organized criminal networks and, in some cases, terrorism, posing direct risks to both public health and international security. And so while the burden falls most heavily on low and middle income countries, this is not a problem confined by geography, as pharmacists are very well aware of. Medicines today move through globalized supply chains, meaning a single weak link can have repercussions far beyond national borders. And this is precisely where pharmacists play a vital role, as the final checkpoint in the supply chain and the frontline defenders of patient safety. Ensuring medicine's quality, counseling patients, and promoting vigilance are essential actions that bridge the gap between policy and practice, protecting patients from preventable harm. In some instances, falsified medical products are almost visually identical to the genuine product. They can be very sophisticated. But in other instances, falsified and substandard medicines can be clearly that they've been tampered with. So there's some following checks that we recommend. Closely examine the condition of the package. In crude falsified products, there will be obvious errors. Even things like spelling mistakes have been reported, inconsistent fonts, grammatical errors, or missing information. In some cases, there's even been, just because the label has been smudged on the barcodes, that was enough to trigger an investigation, and indeed the product itself was falsified. And just like any pharmacist conducting an accuracy check, we would always be looking for the expiry dates and manufacturer details. So legitimate manufacturers are required under national and regional medicines regulations to include their name and address on product packaging in most countries. The absence of a traceable manufacturer or marketing authorization holder address is a key warning sign of a potentially falsified product. And finally, do discuss with your patient where are they purchasing their products. Having a medicines review, this should now be standardized, that we integrate where, if they are going online, that they know how to do this safely, and that they should never purchase any medical products on social media. If you do come across a suspect sample, retain it if it is safe to do so and document details, and report suspicious products to the National Medicines Regulatory Authority, or if not possible, to the WHO Global Surveillance and Monitoring Systems, the GSMS, directly. So here I've included some resources that will be useful to you, particularly if you are educators. So I was involved with developing the curriculum guide and competency framework for pharmacy curriculums on substandard and falsified medicines. And there is now a full handbook that is also designed for educators that addresses specifically the risk of medical products that are sold online. And it's important that consumers protect themselves because social media is a totally deregulated space, and so there is no legal enforcement to remove those products off of the sellers' platforms. And finally, on the regulatory side, there's also the regulatory self-assessment tool available on the FIP website. For your review, please access the references if you'd like to learn more about this topic in more detail. Thank you very much.